Sometimes the most crucial battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words, protocol, and the crushing weight of institutional barriers. When a decorated special operations medic found himself barred from the very operating room where his expertise could save lives, he had no idea that his fight for justice would reach the highest levels of military command and arrive in the most dramatic way possible. The fluorescent lights of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center hummed overhead as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his uniform one final time before approaching the surgical wing. The largest American military hospital outside the United States buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, but today felt different. Today, Marcus was about to confront a wall of bureaucracy that had been building for months. Marcus had spent the last 8 years as a special operations combat medic, earning his credentials through some of the most intense training the military offered. His hands had saved lives in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iraq, and countless classified missions across 3 continents. The 18D designation on his uniform represented thousands of hours of medical training, field experience that most civilian doctors would never see, and a skill set that bridged the gap between battlefield medicine and advanced trauma care. But here at Landstuhl, none of that seemed to matter. The trouble had started 6 weeks ago when Marcus was assigned to the medical center following his return from a particularly challenging deployment. The transition from forward operating bases to a state-of-the-art military hospital should have been smooth. His credentials were impeccable, his recommendations glowing, and his experience undeniable. Yet from his first day, he encountered resistance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. William Henderson, the chief of surgery, had made his position clear during their initial meeting. A tall, imposing man with graying temples and an air of academic superiority, Henderson had barely glanced at Marcus's file before delivering his verdict. The operating rooms at Landstuhl maintained the highest standards of civilian medical practice, he explained. While the military appreciated the combat medic's service, the complex procedures performed here required a different level of expertise. Sergeant Rodriguez, Henderson had said, his voice carrying the condescending tone that Marcus had learned to recognize. Your battlefield experience is certainly valuable, but this is not a field hospital. Our patients require the precision and knowledge that comes from formal medical education, not just practical experience. The dismissal stung, but Marcus had faced worse. He requested to observe surgeries, to demonstrate his knowledge, to prove that his unconventional path to medical expertise had prepared him for exactly this type of work. Each request was met with bureaucratic delays, scheduling conflicts, and polite but firm refusals. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Marcus had arrived early, as was his habit, to review patient files and prepare for his assigned duties in the emergency department. The cases flowing through Landstuhl were unlike anything he had seen in civilian hospitals back home. These were warriors, men and women whose injuries told stories of sacrifice and survival that only someone with his background could truly understand. The emergency call came at 0847 hours. A convoy hit by an improvised explosive device in eastern Afghanistan had resulted in multiple casualties being airlifted to Landstuhl. The severity of the injuries meant that every available surgeon would be needed, and Marcus knew that his skills could make the difference between life and death for at least one of the incoming patients. He had seen the preliminary reports. One soldier had sustained massive trauma to his abdomen and chest, with internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. Another had severe extremity injuries that, if not properly treated, could result in amputation. These were exactly the types of wounds Marcus had treated countless times in forward positions, often with far fewer resources than the fully equipped operating rooms at Landstuhl. When the casualties arrived, the hospital transformed into a well-choreographed machine of medical precision. Marcus moved with the efficiency that had been drilled into him through years of combat deployments, assisting with initial triage and stabilization. His assessment of the most critically wounded soldier aligned perfectly with the attending physician's diagnosis, and his recommendations for immediate intervention were both appropriate and potentially life-saving. It was then that Dr. Henderson appeared, surveying the controlled chaos of the emergency department with his characteristic air of authority. Marcus seized the opportunity, approaching the chief of surgery with a confidence born of experience and desperation. "Sir, I'd like to assist with the abdominal trauma in bed 3. Marcus said, gesturing toward the soldier whose condition was rapidly deteriorating. "I've performed similar procedures in field conditions, and I believe I can be valuable in the OR." Henderson's response was swift and final. "Absolutely not, Sergeant. You are not authorized for surgical procedures in this facility. Return to your assigned duties in the emergency department." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around him, the medical team continued their work, but he could feel the weight of their glances. Some of the nurses, who had worked with special operations medics before, looked confused by Henderson's dismissal. They knew the caliber of training that Marcus represented, understood that in many cases these combat medics had more practical trauma experience than residents who had never seen a gunshot wound. Marcus watched as the most critically wounded soldier was wheeled toward the operating room, his vital signs continuing to decline. The irony was not lost on him. In Afghanistan, he would already be working to save this soldier's life. Here, in one of the world's most advanced military medical facilities, he was relegated to paperwork and basic triage because his medical degree came from the University of Combat rather than the University of Michigan. The surgery took 4 hours. Marcus spent that time in the break room, reviewing the case files and imagining how he would have approached each procedure. His mind raced through the techniques he had learned not from textbooks but from necessity, methods that had been refined under fire and proven effective when traditional approaches failed. When the surgeon finally emerged from the operating room, his expression told the story before his words did. The soldier had survived, but barely. Complications during the procedure had required innovative approaches, and the extended surgery time had pushed the patient's system to its limits. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if his presence in the OR might have made a difference, if his experience with similar traumas could have provided insights that would have shortened the procedure and improved the outcome. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters and composed a letter. Not a complaint, not an angry diatribe against the system, but a formal request for reconsideration. He outlined his qualifications, provided documentation of his training and experience, and included recommendations from commanders who had witnessed his medical skills firsthand. The letter was professional, respectful, and thorough. Dr. Henderson's response came 3 days later. The request was denied. Hospital policy was clear, and exceptions could not be made regardless of an individual's military experience. If Sergeant Rodriguez wished to practice advanced medicine, he was welcome to pursue formal medical education through appropriate civilian channels after his military service concluded. The rejection felt like a betrayal not just of Marcus personally, but of every soldier whose life he had saved in conditions far more challenging than any hospital operating room. The military had trained him to save lives, had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in his education and certification. Yet when the opportunity arose to use those skills in their own medical facilities, bureaucracy took precedence over capability. Marcus's fellow medics rallied around him, sharing similar stories of frustration and institutional resistance. The problem, they explained, was bigger than just one hospital or one administrator. It represented a fundamental disconnect between the military's forward-thinking approach to combat medicine and the conservative, credential-focused culture of traditional medical institutions. But Marcus wasn't ready to accept defeat. If the system wouldn't recognize his qualifications through normal channels, perhaps it was time to explore other options. He began researching the chain of command, looking for someone who might understand the value of his training and the injustice of his situation. What Marcus didn't know was that his story was about to reach ears far more powerful than he could have imagined, and that the solution to his problem would arrive in a way that no one at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center could have predicted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Dr. Taifa. Henderson thought he knew about military medicine, and Marcus was about to learn that sometimes the most unlikely allies can be found in the most unexpected places. Part 2. The weeks following Dr. Henderson's rejection settled into a routine that felt increasingly surreal to Marcus. Each morning, he would report to the emergency department, where his skills were simultaneously valued and limited. The nurses had begun seeking his opinion on difficult cases, often finding his assessments more insightful than those of residents who had never seen combat trauma. Yet when critical cases moved to surgery, Marcus remained behind, watching opportunities to save lives slip away behind operating room doors. The frustration wasn't just personal anymore. Other special operations medics stationed at various points throughout the European theater were reporting similar experiences. Tech Sergeant Jennifer Walsh from Air Force Special Tactics had been denied surgical privileges at Ramstein Air Base despite her extensive trauma training. Navy Hospital Corpsman First Class David Kim, attached to SEAL Team Operations, found himself relegated to basic medical duties at Naval Hospital Naples, despite qualifications that exceeded many of the facility's junior doctors. What had initially seemed like isolated incidents of bureaucratic inflexibility was revealing itself as a systematic problem affecting the most highly trained medical personnel in the military. These were operators whose skills had been honed in the crucible of combat, who had adapted and innovated under conditions that would paralyze traditional medical practitioners, yet they were being sidelined by institutions that prioritized credentials over competence. Marcus began documenting everything. Not just his own experiences, but the broader pattern of qualified military medics being underutilized throughout the medical system. His research revealed a troubling disconnect between the military's investment in advanced medical training and the actual deployment of those skills in military medical facilities. The 18D Special Forces Medical Sergeant Program, for instance, represented one of the most intensive medical training programs in the world. These operators underwent months of advanced trauma medicine, emergency surgery, and field medicine training that exceeded the practical experience of many civilian emergency room doctors. Yet when they returned from deployments, they often found themselves treated as little more than enhanced first aid providers. The economic implications alone were staggering. The military invested approximately $200,000 in training each special operations medic, yet their skills were being systematically underutilized. Meanwhile, military hospitals faced staffing shortages and relied heavily on expensive civilian contractors to fill gaps that could be addressed by properly utilizing their own highly trained personnel. Marcus's investigation led him to Master Sergeant Patricia Coleman, a veteran Special Forces medic who had transitioned to a training role at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. Coleman had spent 15 years in special operations, during which she had performed surgical procedures that would challenge even experienced trauma surgeons. Her insights into the systemic nature of the problem proved invaluable. It's not just about individual hospitals or administrators, Coleman explained during a lengthy phone conversation. This represents a fundamental failure to understand what special operations medicine has become. We're not just battlefield first aid anymore. We're performing complex procedures with minimal resources, adapting techniques that civilian medicine hasn't even considered, and doing it all under conditions that would shut down any hospital operating room. Coleman shared stories that illustrated the scope of the issue. Special Forces medics regularly performed emergency appendectomies in forward operating bases, conducted complex orthopedic repairs with improvised equipment, and managed critical care patients for days without physician oversight. These same individuals were then told they weren't qualified to assist with similar procedures in fully equipped military hospitals. The conversation with Coleman led Marcus to a realization that changed his entire approach to the problem. This wasn't just about his personal frustration or even about improving patient care at individual hospitals. This was about the military's failure to recognize and utilize its own investment in advanced medical training. Armed with this broader perspective, Marcus began reaching out to military medical professionals who might understand the scope of the issue. His inquiries led him to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a career military physician who had worked extensively with special operations forces and understood the unique capabilities they brought to military medicine. Colonel Mitchell's response was immediate and encouraging. She had been tracking similar issues throughout the European theater and was preparing a comprehensive review of military medical personnel utilization. Marcus's documentation and research provided crucial evidence for her investigation. For Marcus and countless other special operations medics, it represented vindication, recognition, and the restoration of their ability to serve their fellow soldiers with the full range of skills that military training had provided.